This is Alvida. This is a slippery fruit, and now this is Alvida. Whoever this is, she has the distinction of being the first pirate punched in the face by a rubber boy in the series, and has gone on a splendid journey to now end up as the commander of an Emperor of the Sea. But was this position deserved? The short answer is no, but the long answer is the rest of this video. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video. This time featuring the woman who loves to go clubbing in all of the worst ways possible, Iron Mace Alvida. We're going to start with the introduction because that seems reasonable to me. And I don't think I've done a single video in this now like almost 30 video series that doesn't mention the word silhouette, and this video is no exception. However, it is slightly different in that Alvida is an antagonist who appears so early on in the series that she actually predates the trademark Oda villain silhouette and first appears in this rather flat and kind of underwhelming, it's a half darkness, whatever it is. In the beginning of One Piece, I do think that Oda was a bit afraid of using too much darkness in his art. Just as we talked about with the Captain Morgan video, Oda originally had a much brighter, goofy, and almost straight comedy intent with his art, but Takanori Asada, the first official editor of One Piece, really pushed Oda into more typically cool elements in order to balance the series out, which is a style that Oda did eventually master, but it took time. And I think that his reluctance to use too much darkness in his art in the very early chapters was part of that process. That aside, Alvida is a simple gal, and she was created to do a handful of very simple things, one of which does not get the appreciation it deserves. As in the anime, Alvida is very much our introduction to Yara pirates, but in the manga, Alvida is actually the second pirate captain that we meet. The first being Shanks in chapter 1. And I guess you could argue that we also met Roger on the very first page, if you want to go all semantic and I'm actually on me, but we didn't get to know him or his philosophy on being a pirate, so I'm not counting it. But Oda, after introducing Shanks and his philosophy in chapter 1, made sure that Alvida was the exact opposite of Shanks in chapter 2. Alvida was worth 5 million berries, and she thought herself to be the very center of the pirating universe. There's even a part where she concocts a completely unique to her own mind-brain story where she's being hunted down by Zoro for her minuscule bounty, which comes after Shanks, who we now know was worth over 1 billion berries in chapter 1 and was the most humble man in East Blue. Shanks didn't and still doesn't hold himself above anyone or anything, which is most clearly seen when Shanks cleans Makino's bar after Higama makes a bit of a mess. And just look at this, makes the captain himself on the floor wiping up, doing what is considered to be the lowest of work. We have crew people to do this, and the very first thing that we see of Alvida is her ordering her crew people to clean her ship because she sees herself as above the lowly act that is upkeep. Little things like that aren't coincidences. Oda took the model of Shanks and he did the exact opposite in every way with Alvida. Another one being that Shanks is very good with kids and Alvida is very good at beating kids. But most importantly, Shanks's iconic line of "good reason or not, nobody hurts a friend of mine" is flipped by Alvida, who, good reason or not, does nothing but hurt and threaten her own crew. So we saw what Luffy looks up to in the pirating world with Shanks, and then the more traditional what a pirate actually is with Alvida. So she's very important to establish that full spectrum of piracy. And speaking of opposites, Alvida is also the first One Piece character to be blessed and or cursed with a classic Oda quirk. In Alvida's case, she believes herself to be the most beautiful woman in the world, despite her aesthetics being more akin to a dugong cosplaying a cowboy. But I do always love this stark juxtaposition that Oda likes to create. And to this day, my favorite application of it is with Raizo, who is the greatest ninja that Wano has ever known, and yet he has absolutely no traditional qualities of a ninja. He's not stealthy, he's so big that he can't blend in, he's also just kind of a fool, and yet somehow he is the perfect ninja. But with Alvida, Oda has gone on to use her specific quirk a number of other times as the series has gone on. He tends to like this idea of women with non-traditionally attractive designs believing themselves to be rather bewitching, such as Dr. Kureha, or speaking of ninjas earlier, Shinobu also had this quirk, but it all started with Alvida, and it was all inspired by her real-life namesake. Oda stated in the SBS of Volume 6 that Alvida was based on Alvide, a Viking princess who was relentlessly pursued by suitors, including a Danish prince, to the point where she decided to dress as a man and became the captain of her own ship, and even formed a crew comprised entirely of women. And what Oda did was subvert that inspiration, turning Alvida into a character who believes that she's being relentlessly pursued by either suitors or bounty hunters who also want to, her. But in reality, she isn't, at least not at this stage. We'll get to the transformation and what inspired that in a bit, but for now, this quirk was a very important factor because it established to the readers and watchers of One Piece that villains don't have to be completely one note. Whereas in chapter 1, Higuma was a pretty standard shonen bad guy. He was a prick and there wasn't much more to him than that. However, with Alvida, Oda gave permission for the rest of the antagonists in One Piece to have these comedic traits, and even with the worst of the worst, we are always able to find something to laugh at, essentially turning all of the readers into joy people able to see life from the perspective of Luffy. But because Alvida is the very first villain that the Toei anime tackles, she's subject to a bunch of very weird anime changes that makes Alvida in general quite difficult to talk about. Episode 1 of the anime is actually based on chapter 2 of the manga, but it adds this whole original plot of Alvida attacking a cruise ship with Nami on board, assumedly to introduce Nami as quickly as possible to help hook in some viewers. And so episode 1 takes place entirely at sea between the two ships. Whereas in the manga, this conflict actually takes place on Alvida's island base. There is no cruise ship, there is no Nami, just a boy in a barrel on a base, seen here looking incredibly underwhelming, not much better than when Luffy and Ace built their own countries on Dawn Island, really. And I can see why they changed it, because it just wasn't that exciting of an opening. But this change in location had some very unexpected consequences. Something very big for Kobe is that because Alvida's base was on an island, he had actually spent the past 2 years slowly building a boat with the intent to escape. And instead of using it for himself, Kobe actually offered the boat to Luffy. Part of this is because Kobe himself didn't have the courage yet to try and mount an escape, but I also think it says so much about the inner good of Kobe, that he gave his only ticket out of slavery to Luffy, a guy he just met without a second thought. Good guy. And that's something that the One Piece anime doesn't give us because it chooses to stage this entire story on the ships, where Kobe obviously can't have been building a secret boat and has no mechanism of escape. And so it becomes less about whether or not Kobe's going to summon the courage to liberate himself, because in the manga he does have the means to do so, and more of a flat story about a trapped boy who couldn't do anything even if he wanted to. Ironically, it kind of robs Kobe of his agency, and I like the idea that Kobe believes that this situation is all but helpless, and yet he has still spent the last 2 years clinging on to what little hope he can find. But more importantly, for the sake of this video, the manga gives Alvida a very symbolic moment, because she discovers Luffy and Kobe scheming together and immediately smashes Kobe's boat. And in less than a second, Alvida has taken away the hope that Kobe has been clinging on to for 2 years, making Alvida a much more compellingly despicable villain than she appears in the anime. And it's at this point that Luffy steps in, only after knowing that Kobe does actually have a will of his own, because you see, Luffy is no hero. He will not help people who refuse to help themselves. They need to have the will to fight on their own, and that boat was proof that Kobe did. And so I do think that the anime lessens Kobe's will to fight, but more importantly, it robs Alvida of that wonderfully villainous moment of crushing Kobe's hope. And this is a shame because Alvida is an antagonist whose arc lasts 1 chapter. So little changes are actually big changes because she has so little to work with. Alvida needs everything she can get to make a decent impression with this video. And one thing that definitely doesn't make a great impression is that Alvida gets Bellamy'd and beaten by Luffy in a single punch. And look, let's be fair, she's the first Luffy antagonist, and her being One Punched Man was a fantastic way to set Luffy up. And the Lord of the Coast got one punch in chapter 1, so Alvida's in pretty good company there. And what I will say for the anime is that this was a much more satisfying defeat there. The manga is quite underwhelming. But of course, this is far from the end of Iron Mace Alvida, although it is the end of Alvida as we know her. As from here, her body undergoes quite the transformation thanks to the Sube no Mi, or the slip fruit, and so all of the excess weight just slipped right off her. And it's often been theorized but never quite confirmed that this is a play on the Ugly Duckling, which is a Nordic fairy tale, so it's in keeping with Alvida's inspiration. But the tale ends with this ugly duckling realizing that it was no duck but a beautiful swan this entire entire time. And the theory here is that Oda turned Alvida into a beautiful swan because Alvida's flagship was called the Miss Love Duck. So you've got the duck connection there, and maybe that was the inspiration. But the cynical part of me says that Oda just needed an excuse to change Alvida's design into something, more appealing if he planned on using her again. And this is 100% pure speculation, but it may even have been suggested by his editor, who again pushed Oda into a less wacky and more conventionally cool and attractive direction whenever he could. And it's difficult to say whether or not this change worked, because from this point on, Alvida, she does linger in the series. She began in East Blue and exists to this very day. We're currently on Elbaf as I'm recording this, and Alvida is present, not on the island, but in the overall story. But despite that presence, she is very much a non-entity. I would say that the most exciting piece of Alvida action by far was her follow-up appearance in the Buggy's Crew Adventure Chronicles, and Alvida certainly does deserve a mention in One Piece A series history for being one of the first characters recycled and rehabilitated by a cover story, and really showing us the potential that these cover stories had going forward. It was actually really fun to see Alvida and of course Mr. Buggy again, which is something that first time around I never thought that I would say about Alvida in particular. And one underrated aspect about using her is that it also gave us one of the very first tastes of One Piece mystery to mull over, because it was obvious that this woman was Alvida, but what was mind-boggling was how Alvida transformed, which there was no explanation for in the cover story. We were only told during Logtown. And if something like this happened today, there would be multiple theory videos on every One Piece channel discussing it endlessly. Now that probably wasn't quite the response to this at the time in the late 90s, but it does a very good job of piquing curiosity about what would otherwise be a completely throwaway character. With that said, unlike a lot of returning antagonists, Alvida doesn't really develop as a character at all, and in fact, I think she very much regresses, because I honestly struggle to find a way to describe thin Alvida's personality as anything other than empty. After the transformation, Alvida lost a lot of character with those kilos. She doesn't get angry anymore, she isn't overly ambitious, she's almost entirely lost a sense of narcissism. It's calmed down significantly at the very least. And I don't know what she is. She's very much just a rather pretty shell who Oda almost goes out of his way to never show expressing any kind of emotion anymore. And I actually feel like the ideal Buggy-Alvida dynamic was later nailed much better with Buggy and Mr. 3, where their increasingly weird, selfish, and comically nefarious ambitions enhance one another. Alvida is much more of a brick wall. She doesn't give Buggy or anyone a lot to work with. And I can't help but feel that Oda didn't really have a plan when reintroducing Alvida beyond the Logtown incident, and now what's happened is that he's ended up a bit stuck with her, as Buggy has risen all the way to the status of Emperor. Although one thing I do very, very much love is that Alvida is now technically considered to be the commander of an Emperor of the Sea. So on the Punk Records wiki page of historical Emperor commanders, one day you'll see King, Marco, Katakuri, and Alvida all talked about in equivalence to one another, as if they were all equally as influential figures on this world. And you just know that in Alvida's section, they are going to mention how she evilly managed to enslave hero of the Marines Kobe for 2 years. In retrospect, that's gonna look like quite the feat. So she's definitely benefited from being an earlier villain, I guess the earlier villain. And I will admit that even though there's nothing to work with, it is always nice to see Alvida, because Alvida reminds me of exactly how far Luffy has come since his very first pirate battle. Something that we're reminded of in almost every One Piece game as well, as Alvida is a heavily overrepresented character in game media. Alvida happens to be a playable character in 14 One Piece games, an enemy to defeat in a further 11 games, as a support appearance in another 5 games, and rocks up in a completely non-playable function in another 4 games, for a total of 34 One Piece games featuring Alvida. More than any other villain with the exception of Buggy. And it's also worth mentioning that Alvida is early enough that she was subject to the 4Kids English dub of One Piece, where she sounded a little something like this.
Oh, now, Luffy, don't you dare tell me that you don't recognize this face of mine.
Oh!
And I believe that she was given a southern accent because of that there cowboy hat, because the exact same thing happened to Nico Robin with her cowboy hat.
I'm gonna take the little princess back to the castle and give her sugar and spice and everything nice.
So 4Kids really inundated Luffy with southern bales, and you can tell that Nico Robin in particular was heavily American localized because she says both sue me and arm yourself, thus giving us the full pantheon of what it is to be an American. And I'd also like it noted that in the 4Kids Alvida scene in Logtown, we see the Logtown police threatening Alvida and Luffy with water pistols. And look, in their defense, to a devil fruit user, water pistols might actually be effective. I don't know. It's honestly not the dumbest thing that 4Kids did. Meanwhile, Alvida's live action English portrayal would be seen as far more successful. I myself actually really like Alvida in the live action, and I think she's a lot more memorable in that series than either the anime or the manga, with a very good balance of narcissism and brutality. And there's also a really fun Alvida Easter egg in the live action. With the introduction of the Love Duck, Alvida's crew members are holding a mirror, and this is because of an SBS question that Oda was asked all the way back in Volume 6, which was, is there a mirror on Alvida's ship? Which I suppose had to be asked because people were questioning Alvida's eyes. Whoa, hey, she's gonna throw a club at me. Don't ask me. Man, what a dangerous question. Something tells me that there is no mirror. Donk. Whoa, she threw something. And you also have to give Alvida's actress nothing but credit for the dedication of replicating Alvida's transformation, as she has now transformed her own body but without the gift of fictional fruit to assist the process. But back to Alvida as we know her. In many ways, it's not fair to rank an antagonist who only served for a single chapter, but Alvida has such a large and lengthy legacy that it makes her impossible to ignore. I will say that she did her one chapter job perfectly, it's just that there wasn't much to be done. And if it was just that, then fine, decent ranking, but the real letdown is with her lack of evolution ever since, because she has been part of One Piece since the very beginning, 28 years, and it's just incredibly underwhelming compared to every other antagonist, and especially compared to Buggy, who was introduced in the same era, and as mentioned before, he is now an Emperor of the Sea. It really highlights just how much Alvida hasn't done or hasn't been given to do, because ever since Logtown, she's just kind of been a frozen statue that gets carted around wherever Buggy's crew goes. So I think this might sound harsh, but the only fair place I see for Alvida is E tier, which I think is a fantastic sign for One Piece as a whole. We really want it to be nothing but up from our first villain, and for the most part, that is exactly what we get. But you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next.